Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our performance of Succession, Finance, Legal Rights and Tax Planning, a play. The Montefarm programme is totally farmer-led and farmer-driven, and succession in family farming businesses is certainly a crucial area to be discussed. I am delighted to introduce our cast for tonight's production. Firstly, the Buchan family. Mum is played by Jane Mitchell of Johnston Carmichael. Dad is played by Stephen Buchan of Virgin Money. The daughter is played by Hannah Greenlaw of Johnston Carmichael, and the son is played by Matthew McGilvery of Johnston Carmichael. Secondly, the professionals. Graham Leith, an accountant from Johnston Carmichael, Rona Jordan, an agricultural banker from Virgin Money, Petra Grunenberg, a solicitor from Shepherd and Wedderburn. All play themselves. Now to set the scene. Jane and Stephen have been farming in partnership together under the name S&J Farms. The partnership is a livestock and cropping enterprise. There is an owned farm called Hill Farm of 400 acres, held in the name of Jane and Stephen. There is also a 1991 Act tenancy over Glen Farm, 200 acres of hill ground, held in just Stephen's name, which he took over from his father when he died some years ago. The family have the opportunity of purchasing some additional land from a neighbour through a private sale and will need bank funding for this. Muckles Farm is 300 acres, paying 1.5 million as verbally agreed with the neighbour before the budget. Matthew, Stephen and Jane's son, has now been working at home for about 6 years, and the family see him long term as the future of the business. He got married 2 years ago and has a wee baby. He lives in a cottage on the farm and is currently an employee of the partnership. He had a successful career in the oil industry. Hannah, Stephen and Jane's daughter, qualified as a veterinary nurse and on occasion helps out on the farm during busy times. She has a good relationship with her brother. She is about to marry and will stay locally as her husband is a local doctor. The family has also been approached by a developer who is seeking to enter into an option for a battery storage site on the farm. This development would take up about 5 acres of land. The firm has some outstanding borrowing from their investments in the farm over the last few years with the bank and have an overdraft facility. So sit back, relax, and let's journey to a farm not so far, far away and be a fly on the wall with the Buchan family.
Okay, Petra, Rhoda and Graham, look, massive thank you for coming and speaking to the family tonight. It's massively appreciated. It's great to have this much intellect around the table. It's a challenge sometimes just sitting around the table with Jane, so thanks very much for coming. Rhoda's aware, but I've had my eye on Muckles Farm for, must be 10 years now, I think. And we shook hands on a deal just 2 or 3 months ago for me to buy it at 1.5 million.
Wasn't aware of that.
I was you didn't really ready to go with that, Jane.
Rona,
know either,
I wasn't aware of that either. It would have been good if he'd actually discussed it with me beforehand.
It's only 1.5, it's fine. So it's 1.5, but obviously it is a big commitment on our side, and I'm very conscious we've got a budget and we've just gone through a budget. So I think the key thing for me tonight is just to understand not just the options with Muckle, obviously we need, well, hopefully you'll give me the money to conclude, but we also need to look at the business long term and make sure the structure is correct. There's an awful lot in press about limited companies, trusts, partnerships, on balance sheet, off balance sheet. I don't have a clue what any of that is, but keen to look at it. I've also keen for Matthew and Hannah to be involved in the current discussions as well. They're the next generation, and any decision we make tonight is fundamentally going to impact on them. So sort of keen just to start kicking the discussions off. And Rona, you just need to nod your head and say you're definitely going to give me the 1.5 million, or Jane's going to kill me.
It's a lot of money he's looking to borrow, that's my concern.
It is a lot of money, and if only it was that easy, Stephen. Lots to consider when you're looking to borrow money, but I think if you've got the chance of buying somewhere close by in a private deal, then it's something that you've got to look at, and delighted to speak to you about that.
If we didn't buy it now, we're not going to get the chance again.
No. So, but the main thing is, can you afford it? Affordability would be the main consideration. £1.5 million, you might not think it's very much money, but I think it'll take you quite a while to pay that back.
Jane thinks she's an accountant, though. She'll work it out. It'll be fine.
If only that were the case, Stephen. Let's see what Rona's got to say about it.
Yeah. Well, what I would be saying is that it'll take you a while to pay it back. Borrowing that amount of money, 15, 20, 25 years. You know, it's long-term borrowing.
I'll be 50 by then.
So you need to think about the long-term viability of the business. And yeah, where are you going to be in 20, 25 years' time? Are you still going to be fit to be farming? Still going to have Jane by your side helping you out?
Not at this rate.
And what about Matthew? Like, you know, are you still going to be happy with Dad leaning over your shoulder in 20 years' time? Or are you going to had enough of him by then? So that's what you need to think about, is, you know, where things are going over a long period of time, up to 25 years. And another thing, as you mentioned, budget, that you need to consider is there could be a potential inheritance tax liability somewhere in that period of time, and that's something that you might need to find cash for. So how are you going to fund that if you throw all the money at a farm purchase just now?
Matthew, she's talking to you, just so you know.
Need to consider who's going to borrow the money. So at the moment, you've got an overdraft facility. You've still got a wee bit left in the loan from that shed that you built. And that borrowing is in the partnership name. So there are 2 of you in the partnership at the moment.
Apparently.
So as it stands, just 2 of you there, but we need to think what would happen if something happens to one of you. You can't have a partnership with only one partner. That would then become a sole trader. So if we're looking at the partnership continuing and the borrowing being in the partnership name, we maybe need to look at the next generation and possibly involving Matthew in that. So is that something that you've thought about?
Yeah, I mean, we're keen to involve the younger generation. And despite you thinking you're still 25, the reality is you're not, Stephen. So yeah,
26, okay.
we do need to discuss in a little bit more detail how we bring the children in, and I'm sure that'll come through in the discussion.
Yeah.
And would we be better off setting up a limited company and working like that rather than being in a partnership?
Some people do that. That's more common now than it used to be, and it's something that that you could look at. From the bank's point of view, it's not quite so easy. If you set up a new company, then that's a new entity, and it doesn't have a track record with the bank. As well as that, the balance sheet is probably what we would tend to call weak. So we need to look at where the assets are sitting. Quite often, if there are assets introduced, then there are corresponding directors' loans. So we need to just look at where are the assets and where is the security coming from with that. Security, at the moment, you've got security for the partnership, but if it was a company, we'd need to reconstitute that. We would need to take extra security. So there would be a bit of extra costs involved in doing it through a company. But yeah, if you wanted to do that, we could look at it.
What would the extra security be?
Well, we would have to take what we call a floating charge over the company's assets.
Okay.
We would need to look at if there's still partnership borrowing or if there's not, if that all comes into the company, and then possibly guarantees. But there's an awful lot to consider when you go down the limited company route. And I really think you would need to speak to Graham about that and see what his advice was on that.
Yes. If you were to incorporate the business, you would pay corporation tax on the profits instead of income tax. While corporation tax rate is lower than income tax rates, you're required to consider how to extract the funds from the company. It's important to appreciate that there are tax implications on extracting funds from a company, unlike in a partnership, where once tax has been paid in the share of profits, the funds can be withdrawn with no further tax, subject to the funds being available. You would become directors of the company and pay tax on the salary and any dividends you take. A company can be beneficial if you are consistently exposed to higher rate tax. However, if a significant level of income is required and is extracted from the company, there may be little or no benefit to incorporating the business. Benefit in kind rules apply to directors of companies, whereas they don't apply to partners in a partnership. This is where there's a tax charge on benefits provided, for example, on companies' cars or private health cover paid by a company. In the recent budget, it was announced that the change to the rules on double cab pickups, which were previously announced in February but quickly reversed, are to be reintroduced from April. This is where double cab pickups are to be classed as cars, resulting in an increased benefit in kind charge. Companies required to submit accounts to Companies House annually, and these are publicly available to everyone online. Currently, abbreviated accounts are submitted. However, in the future, a profit and loss account will also require to be submitted and available online.
I'm not sure we're going to like that. I mean, you don't even tell me you put in an offer for a farm. How are you going to be able
Now,
to
to
share
be fair,
your...
I haven't put the offer in, I just shook hands. So, not at that stage yet. But no.
We did speak about this before, and I think before you were quite keen not to have your accounts published. So if that is really important to you, then I think, as Graham says, you'd have to weigh up. There would have to be quite a lot of substantial other benefit for you to go limited, really.
Feels complicated.
It is a downside. And there's also, if you're a limited company, debts are limited to the company, meaning that if the company becomes bankrupt, or the creditors cannot go after the individual shareholders.
That sounds good.
However, unless there's personal guarantees or the directors have been negligent. Now, while the partnerships had a couple of good years, we've been able to avoid higher rate tax by farm averaging over 5 years. However, companies cannot farm average profits. So under the circumstances, I would advise you to remain as a partnership.
The other thing that you have to consider is your tenancy. Mm-hmm. So, of course, you've got to protect the tenancy, Stephen. So if you are farming through a partnership, there's not a problem with paying the rent and things like that through the partnership. But if you go limited, that becomes a separate legal entity, and you'd have to think carefully about how you do that, because you don't want to jeopardise who's farming that tenancy, that holding. So it's something else that we'd need to have a think about. So I know that we've had this discussion a couple of times before, and I think I always got the impression that you were maybe much keener to stick with the partnership setup.
I think so.
And to assume Matthew into that, and that's definitely something that we could look at.
I have £250,000 that I can give to the business to help out, but if I'm going to make that investment, then I need to become a partner, I think.
250,000? Did everybody else hear that? You got 250 grand? Okay, sorry, back to the script. Yes, well, I suppose if Matthew's putting £250,000 in, I think it's only fair that he becomes a partner.
I would agree. You know, he's worked hard in his career. And good that you haven't spent all that money and saved a bit of it.
No, I'm still paying for his phone.
And we also need to think about Hannah as well. We can't discount Hannah in all of this. She's an important part of this family. Would you share her as a child together as well?
Thank you, Mum.
Appreciate you reminding me of that, thank you.
So are we all happy that we are sticking with the partnership?
I think so, yeah.
And, you know, we can speak about Hannah's position later on a wee bit, but we're definitely agreeing, I think, and in light of the borrowing, I think that's what the bank would want, that we take Matthew in as a partner going forward. So we need to have a little bit of think about how we structure this. So Matthew, you're very kindly offering your savings up here, which is good, and that can obviously go towards a deposit, towards the purchase of muckles. But we need to have a think about how we structure the purchase of muckles. So before the budget, I think we would have just bought it in the name of the partnership, and we wouldn't have probably thought too much about it. But we do now need to think about that a wee bit more. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to increase the ownership that you, Stephen, and you, Jane, already have. So we want to try and, as much as possible, put things already into the hands of the next generation. So that would be Matthew in this case. So what that would mean is that what we would do, the way we would structure it, is that the bank would lend the money to the partnership, so it would still be a partnership debt, but we'd take the 250,000 that Matthew's putting down as a deposit, and we would register the title to the farm just in Matthew's name. So it could be in the partnership still, but it would only be allocated to Matthew, so he would be the only beneficial owner of it. Now, I want to stress that point because it's important for the two of you that you understand what that means. So you're signing up as a partnership to a debt, but you are accepting that the asset will be Matthew's. It will be subject to the debt for as long as it exists, but Matthew could at some point obviously decide that maybe he's not so keen to stay in partnership with mum and dad. So we'd need to have a think about that. And I think, you know, we'll want to have a chat with Graham probably about whether we bring it into the partnership, the farm, the new farm, whether we put it on the balance sheet or whether we don't have it on the balance sheet.
Yeah, absolutely. Having the farm on the balance sheet strengthens the balance sheet. However, this means that the farm is movable property for legal rights claims on your estate. Whereas if the farm is not on the balance sheet, it's heritable property for legal rights purposes on which legal rights cannot be claimed. Given the announcement in the budget, it makes sense for the purchase of Muckle Farm to be an asset of Matthew's and not to increase the assets of Stephen and Jane. This could be by purchasing land in Matthew's own name or through the partnership, with it being solely allocated to Matthew in the accounts. This would require Matthew to become a partner. You could consider bringing Matthew's wife into the partnership and giving her a share of Muckle's farm. Given the proposed changes to agricultural property relief and business property relief, this would potentially give additional inheritance tax relief and use some of her £1 million allowance.
I think from the bank's point of view, as long as we've got security, we'd be happy, whether it's on the balance sheet.
Or off, yeah.
And we'll have a little bit further discussion whether we bring your wife in or not, Matthew, because actually you've not been married that long.
Jane doesn't even know your wife's name.
Yeah, so that's just something that we need to all have a think about. But I think if we're all comfortable around the table with Matthew coming in, he brings in his £250,000 capital. We use that towards Muckles, and then obviously the balance would be borrowed funds. But everybody should just understand that's how we deal with it. So when we bring Matthew in, what would happen is that because Muckles will just be allocated to Matthew, anything that happens or that's relating to Muckles, like if there was a sale or an increase in value over time, that would solely be allocated to Matthew. So neither of the two of you, although you're paying off the loan as well, would get the benefit of that. So you just need to be clear on that. You know, and we'd have to have a discussion in a bit more detail about how we deal with profits and things like that within the partnership. And there's a couple of options there that we can cover.
Yeah, Matthew, you currently receive a salary through PAYE. When you become a partner, this will stop and you will receive a share of profits each year and will require to complete a tax return annually to declare the tax payable, which is paid in January and July each year. You can take weekly or monthly drawings from the partnership to fund personal expenditure. I suggest that the partnership agreement has a salary clause for flexibility, so that the first allocation of profits can be allocated perhaps to Matthew for the work he does. The remaining profits could be shared a third each or some other agreed allocation.
Yeah, I mean, Matthew is doing more and more of the work as you become less fit. You have to admit.
Can't get any less fit than I already am.
So it's only fair that he's remunerated properly just for what he's doing. And we're going to be away so much. You know, you've promised me all these holidays.
I know, I've got the caravan looked out. We're sorted.
I'm not quite sure that's what I had in mind. We'll maybe have a further discussion offline on that.
Are we offline? Yeah, communication seems to be a problem in our relationship. But there you go.
So when we're bringing Matthew in, what we'll need to do, because I think, am I right in thinking that you don't actually have a written partnership agreement at the moment? Is that right? So we need to rectify that first of all, and we'll use Matthew coming in that's a good point to do that, and I'm sure the bank will be much happier that you actually have something in writing as well. So a couple of things that we'll discuss in terms of the detail of that, one being how profits are shared, and there's options there as Graham's just noted. The other things that will be important that we cover off is things like continuation clauses. So what this is that we want to make it clear that if somebody dies or somebody retires, which is maybe less likely, but if somebody dies and comes out of the partnership, that the partnership continues on. Because if you don't make provision for that in your partnership agreement, then normally on death of a partner, the partnership would terminate. And obviously, nobody would be happy about that. You wouldn't be happy about that because it would cause you some practical difficulties. The bank would be very unhappy about that because it would mean that the borrowing would have to be refinanced and your bank account would get closed. So we'll want to make sure that we have all of that covered off in the partnership agreement as well. And, you know, I can prepare a draft based on some of the discussions we've had already. We'll circulate it, we'll make sure that Graham has his input on it as well, and then we can take that forward maybe.
Good. Just in relation to Muckles, or not in relation to Muckles, where should the farm ownership sits once Matthew comes into the partnership?
Well, that's definitely something that now I think we'll have to discuss following the budget in October. So I think we need to start looking at what you actually have between the two of you and what your inheritance tax position would be at the moment.
Okay.
So to do that, I would suggest that we actually do get some proper valuations done, get some up-to-date valuations done, because the tenancy, well, you took that over from your dad. Yeah, there's a value in that. And then obviously the farm that you already own, you bought a long, long time ago. So again, I know we're all guessing at how much that's worth now, but we probably should get a proper valuation done so that we actually have some figures to look at. And then also make a wee list about other things that you have, and then work out what how big your inheritance tax problem is really, taking into account your other allowances that you're allowed, because in addition to the 1 million that you get on the farm, obviously you'll also have your normal nil rate band and your residential nil rate band, potentially depending on the value of your estate. So we can have a look at that.
I think we'll be surprised what the value is, and in my head, I think we've got a problem just with what the budget is.
It's unlikely. There's not going to be an awful lot of people who own a farm and have a tenancy and are going to buy another one and will not exceed that 1 million threshold. So I'd say that's probably very unlikely that you're going to have a problem, but it's how big the problem is and how easy it is to fix.
Well, the government says it's only the top 2 or 3%.
Well, Matthew is keen to have some assets in his name, so we need to bear that in mind as well.
Yeah. So there are options there, and we can look at either lifetime gifting or doing something there. But obviously there's a tax consequence on that.
Okay.
Yeah. Once we've obtained the valuations and established the value of your individual estates, we can look at lifetime transfers to reduce your estate. Assets gifted during lifetime will remain in your estate for 7 years. After 7 years have passed, the gift will fall out with your estate. Capital gains tax requires to be considered on the gift of assets, and a tax charge may be avoided if the transfer qualifies for gift holdover relief. This is a relief where an asset can pass at original cost, provided it qualifies. The recipient will pay capital gains tax on any future sale of the asset on the gain between the original cost and the price realised. Provided Hill Farm qualifies for gift holdover relief, the farm could be gifted to Matthew now with no capital gains tax, and after 7 years the value will fall out with your estates. Should anything happen to Stephen or Jane within the 7-year period, your share of the value of the gift remains in your estate for inheritance tax. However, if you survive 3 years, the inheritance tax liability reduces and reduces each year after that. The disadvantage of lifetime giving and claiming holdover relief is that you do not get the uplift to market value on assets that you inherit, like in assets you inherit, resulting in potentially higher capital gains tax in the future.
They get you one way or the other, don't they?
The cost of Hill Farm when acquired was £1,000 an acre. If you gift that now to Matthew, he would take it on at that value and avoid the capital gains tax. If he inherited the farm on death, he would inherit at the market value at that time. Right. We can discuss this further once the valuations have been received and we've decided what to do with the Muckles farm.
That's why it's important that we have some actual figures to look at, because what we might want to do is actually not gift all of it over and keep some of it back that falls within your own allowances and allow that to pass on death, which would allow at least Matthew or Hannah or wherever it goes to take that at an uplifted base cost. Now, like Graham says, the base costing doesn't matter if you keep farming. If Matthew keeps going and he never sells anything, it doesn't matter. But we don't know what lies in the future or what the plans would be, or some opportunity might come your way whereby you decide to sell some bits and buy other bits somewhere else. So it's important that Matthew particularly understands, if he is gifted assets, what that means for him in the long term.
And can I ask, if Matthew decided that farming wasn't for him and he went back to the oil industry, where would I stand to do with if he just sold the farm?
Yeah, so this is obviously something, Hannah, that is always a challenge. I think we can speak freely here probably. We've had these discussions before and you've said you wanted them both to understand where we are with that. So your mum and dad obviously are thinking at this point in time that your brother is the one who's going to take the farm forward. So they are trying to protect the farm as much as possible and pass as much of it as they can to Matthew without paying any tax.
Yeah.
So sadly that means that you're being excluded from quite a valuable asset. And although I know there's been discussions about you being involved with the business, it's maybe never going to be to the extent that Matthew is going to be. So your parents have been thinking about what do they do for you. And what we have been talking about is personal wealth, things like savings and things like that, and trying to direct that to you. The reality of it is, Hannah, is that if you are not happy with what your parents provide for you in their wills, then your only alternative is to make a claim of legal rights. And legal rights would be a share of your parents' movable estate, so it would be things like their savings, cash, but also their partnership interests. So if the farms sit on the balance sheet, they would become part potentially of that legal rights claim. So that's part of the discussions that we need to have. So what we have been thinking about is other assets and what's available. And I think, Jane, your mum died not long ago, so you are about to inherit, I think, some assets, and that's maybe what we were thinking.
Yeah, so I've got a bit of cash that I've inherited in a property as well, and in light of Matthew showing the interest that he has in the farm would go to Matthew, and these other more liquid assets would potentially come to you, Hannah.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we've spoken about as well with your mum is that because your granny's estate's not been wound up yet.
Yeah.
So you are able under law to do a deed of variation within 2 years from the date of death. So it might be that your mum decides to vary your granny's will. So instead of those assets passing to your mum, they would come direct to you. Now the benefit for your mum would be is that they don't come through her estate, so they don't affect her own inheritance tax position. So that's a positive thing. The downside is obviously, Jane, that you're not ever getting the assets. So it's a decision about, do you need it? Do you need the income? You know,
do I want a caravan holiday, or do I want something better?
Yeah, well, that might be what it comes down to.
Caravan holiday.
Yeah, but that's a fair point. So I know that you've been thinking about that. So it's just something to keep in the back of our mind. But your mum and dad are trying to make some provision for you, Hannah.
Yeah.
But obviously, when the time comes, if your mum is redirecting assets to you, or if they're making lifetime gifts to you now, your mum and dad, you would be asked to sign a discharge of your legal rights, basically to stop you from claiming against something that they want to go to your brother, and you would have to go and take your own advice on that. But you know, but we're a wee bit away from that at the moment. But just to be aware that that's kind of what we would be doing.
Okay.
So, so we'll talk about that, Jane, once you a wee bit more, maybe once it's a bit clearer what's in your mum's estate and what we need to do.
And you're quite happy with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it was always the hope that Matthew would take the farm on, but I think it's absolutely right that Hannah benefits in some way, shape or form, so there seems to be an equitable solution that also keeps the farm going, which ultimately is my goal. So, yeah, it looks good to me.
Yeah. And I'm also thinking, you know, Matthew's got a big part in the farm, but Hannah is still really quite interested. You're here most weekends. So just the record keeping, we're going to be away a lot. I'm not going to be able to keep the books and records up to date so much. So it would be a good idea just to start involving Hannah in that as well, just, you know, to give you a little bit of interest in what's happening with the farm.
Yeah, and I'd be keen to do that.
Yeah, I think from our point of view, from the bank's point of view as well, that'd be quite good if there's somebody else from a practical point of view that has awareness of the bookkeeping side of things.
Wi-Fi's not so good in a caravan.
No, definitely better on a cruise, Jane.
How could Wi-Fi be better on a cruise? It's in the middle of the water.
No, it's better on a cruise than in a caravan in general.
Yeah. But that's good, and so that's fine. So I think we know what we're doing on the partnership anyway. We know which direction we're going, so we can make some moves on that. So that's good. The other thing that we have spoken about as well in the past, and that goes for both of you, Jane and Stephen, but also for Matthew and maybe Hannah as well, is to make sure that you've got up-to-date wills and powers of attorneys and things like that in place. Now, remind me, I think the two of you have wills, but they're maybe a little bit out of date.
Actually, just after the children were born, we got our wills done. I was just looking in the desk the other day. Hard to believe it's that long ago.
Yeah. It's not long ago then, really. They're fairly young.
25 years ago, Stephen. It's amazing we've lasted that long.
So it's probably fair to say that they're probably a very straightforward to each other, to the kids or something like that. So we obviously need to have a look at that and update that.
These two will need it as well because
well, if Matthew's going to be buying muckles, he definitely needs to have one in place. And also, Matthew, you're married, you've got a wee one yourself, so it is important that you have, I think, for people of all ages. So we'll look at that. We'll get that in place. The power of attorneys as well is just to cover yourselves. The bank would be keen for that to be there as well, in case something happens. You know, people, when they hear power of attorney, they think, oh, mental incapacity, but it's not just that. You know, farmers, lots of accidents, lots of people, you know, being maybe out for a little bit. So it's important that we have all of that covered off. So that's fine. So I can speak to you all about that separately at some point. But we'll pick up on that, and we've already had some discussions about that, Jane and Stephen.
Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good. So what we'll need to think about as well now, which we probably didn't so much in the past, is about inheritance tax. If there's going to be any, who's going to be responsible for paying it, i.e. where will it fall? So before we would have been quite happy to pass the farm to Matthew, would have assumed there was no too little tax to pay, and we wouldn't have really thought about it much further than that. But now, if we are going to have some tax, maybe we do need to think about whose responsibility that will be, and make sure that it's, wherever it lands, it's affordable and there will actually be money there to be had to pay it. So we'll have a wee think about that, and maybe look at your life policies and things like that as well, to see what's still on the go there.
It's the cash flow of if there is any inheritance tax to pay. That's the thing that concerns me. Just what cash flow have we got available for that? If we're also paying for the new farm as well through the partnership.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well, talking about cash flow, the other thing, Stephen, that you mentioned to me is the battery storage.
Yes.
The approach that you've had. Yep. So I believe you're just negotiating heads of terms still at the moment, so we're not far into it.
No, but I think the heads of terms are just about there. So we're confident we're going to get something. So we're not finalised yet, but definitely confident we're going to end up with something.
That's good.
Keep it at that.
Okay. So the benefit, obviously, I mean, I know we've spoken about this before, is that battery storage only takes up a small amount of land, maybe 5-6 acres, but it can give you a really good additional income stream, you know. It's also maybe an opportunity to think about doing something for Hannah long term. So, you know, if we are going to go down the route of the battery storage, we want to have a think about, do we hive that land that's affected off into maybe a separate entity, maybe a limited company or another partnership, and Hannah could have some involvement in that, so she could get some of the income from that. It's just another way of making some provision for her long term. Yeah. You know, and Graham would have to have a discussion about, you know, what form or shape that takes if we're going to separate it out.
Absolutely. Once the site is stopped being used for agricultural purposes and is being let for battery storage, the value of the site will not qualify for agricultural property relief or business property relief. Consideration requires to be given to whether the inclusion of the battery storage and income in the partnership would affect business property relief of the farming business and ensure that the business is still wholly or mainly farming to qualify for business property relief. You could transfer the site to a limited company prior to the project proceeding, with shares being held by family members. Some of the shares could be given to Hannah so that she can share in the income generated.
It's like a no-brainer, doesn't it?
It's certainly something to be looked at. A shareholders' agreement would require to be drawn up, which sets out clear ground rules between the shareholders to ensure nothing is left to chance. The shareholders' agreement should clearly define things like share ownership, company management, dividend policy, share transfer policy, and how shares will be valued.
It certainly sounds like a good idea, to be brutally honest. And again, it gives Hannah an income, and it probably provides an income from me and Jane as well. So, and I'm not seeing any downside to moving that. In fact, quite the opposite. It seems an obvious thing to move on to the limit company.
Yeah, that sounds like a good option to me.
Mm.
Just from the bank's point of view, though, if that land is going to be in a separate company, then we just need to look at that security position that I spoke about before, if we release that from our security. And also bearing in mind that the income that's going to come from that, we won't take into account when we're looking at our servicing for the loan that we're looking at the moment.
Yeah, so it would be a separate thing. But that's good. So, you know, that's next steps. Once you've got your heads of terms agreed and we move to the option, we can look at that, and we'd have to speak to Rona about getting that land. If we're going to move it over, we'd have to get that land released from the security, so the bank would have to be comfortable on that.
Perfect. I think we've just about come to the end. So look, a massive thank you. My head is spinning. I've had terms, or have things, you've said things that probably take me 3 weeks to understand. I know Jane's been reading up on it, but I haven't a clue. So, right, excuse me, but we will be coming back. But I suppose from my point of view, I've kind of been writing down notes just to make sure that I know, because there seems to be a lot I'm going to have to go and do next. I suppose for me the priority is the funding, so we need to agree the funding.
Yep.
And we also need to know whose title, the name of the title, is it going into Matthew, so we need to tell you that. Presumably, Peter, you'll need that as well to put the formal offer in. So that's priority one. Second priority, we've heard it a lot, but we'll need to do a statement of assets and liabilities, and it looks like we're going to have to value and get up-to-date valuations, because anything we've got is speculation, so we need to get that nailed down.
We need them for the bank as well.
Yeah, that's true. Well, do I do them or will you do them?
We'll do them.
Right, well, that's handy. And
You'll pay for them.
Oh, that's kind of no real upside to that one at all, then, is it? So that's fine, we'll get that done. We also need to decide on any provision for Hannah, because we need to get the IHT in the wells, and that's what we need to get that sorted. And the final thing I've got is the partnership agreement. So we need to discuss, Jane, any transfers to Matthew now, so that'll need to be incorporated within that. And we also need to chat through Muckles and Hill Farm as to whether or not they are on or off balance sheet. So once we've decided that, we can get the well sorted.
And we need to decide it quickly, because I'm desperate to get on these holidays. So we won't go with your usual time scale of there's always tomorrow.
There is.
Don't
Well,
worry,
there's
Jane.
not in this instance.
We'll make sure that it keeps moving, because, you know, I'll just wait for you to agree the funding, because that's step one, really,
Yep.
and then we can put
That's the easy bit.
put an offer in.
I understood all of that bit.
Yeah.
It was
But the
tax bit.
valuations will be a part of that, so it will
Yeah.
give us a lot of information at the same time, and then we can sort of, and I can start drafting the partnership agreement, and then, you know, it will all hopefully come together.
Yep.
At the same time, but there'll be lots of additional questions and lots
I
of
think there
further
will.
discussions, but we've got a plan anyway, so
Yeah.
that's a good thing.
I think that was the biggest surprise. I mean, I thought I knew some of it, but I actually didn't know most of it. And everywhere we seem to go, nothing's easy. And there's consequences on either side. So that's been quite illuminating, if I'm being honest. So thank you for that. It's been really good.
Yep. And we've got Nicola to see next, because she's going to give us just an update on what happened in the budget. So we're looking forward to hearing from her.
Excellent.
Just
I tell you,
next.
I've never seen the living room look this good. Maybe we can get a TV camera in. You know. Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.